Yes.
Anyway, good evening, everybody. Let's start. It's 6 o'clock. At least it is here. We are Annie less tonight. Annie is involved in some flower show in London or other, so we're not seeing her tonight. I've asked Kurt Wilkinson from Adelaide in South Australia to join us as co-host. So thanks a lot, Kurt, for joining us way past your bedtime, because I know it's midnight there.
It's actually 2:30 in the morning.
Is it? Oh my God. Well, thank you so much for joining us. Much appreciated.
I owe you. No, I've pushed you pretty hard a few times, though.
For those of you who might not have been here before, this is Thursday Garden Chat, which is the weekly public service broadcast from Garden Masterclass. Normal Business is putting on live events, most of them in the British Isles, and through the October through to May, we do a webinar program. We've got hundreds of hours of material online accessible to members. And we've got our YouTube channel, and we've also got about 100 hours of recorded, information-packed recorded webinars. You can keep in touch with us by signing up for our monthly email. That's at the bottom of the homepage on the website, or you can join us. And if you join us, there are advantages, discounts, access to the members' archive of these talks, and much else besides. But as a public service broadcast, we do this for nothing. It's something we started since the COVID period. And we do very much appreciate donations if you're able to donate something to help us keep this as a free public service broadcast. Now, one of the things we like to do on Thursday Garden Chat is to talk to the authors of new garden and landscape books. And I'm really pleased that this evening we've got the authors of Shrouded in Light, Kevin Williams and Michael Guidi from the west of the United States, who have written what I think is probably going to be one of the most important garden-related books of the decade. It's incredibly provocative. It really kicks ass, as the Americans say. It's uncompromising. It's unusual. The photography is fantastic, and it's the sort of thing we've come to expect from the American West Coast. Refreshing ideas, innovation, and provocation. So this evening comes with a couple of trigger warnings. There may be swearing. There will be loud music. And there will be scenes of a shrubby nature from the very beginning. So, first of all, I think we must talk to the publisher, Anna Mumford. Now, this is one hell of a feather in your cap to have this amazing book from the US West Coast published by you from your garden shed in Bath, as opposed to some swishy corporate office in the US. So, how come you managed to commission these guys?
Well, these guys got in touch and sent
pretty... It crept up towards the shed in your garden, did they?
Yeah, I can't remember exactly how, but something like that. Yeah, kind of ambushed me with their proposal. And yeah, it was just instantly very excited about it, partly because we haven't had a book on shrubs for a long time. And this seemed like it was doing something very different with shrubs, which in the past have always been sort of relegated to the back of the border or clipped within an inch of their life or something like that. And suddenly we were out there in the American West with these wonderful landscapes and shrubs interacting, shrubs being collaborative, shrubs harboring other plants and harboring all sorts of wildlife and biodiversity, and tolerating extremes of temperature in all sorts of unusual situations. And just seemed to me so relevant for gardeners, and a real opportunity to put shrubs in a completely different light. So I grabbed it.
Bet you did. So Michael, why did you go to Anna as opposed to certain other publishers we shall not name? We could name them, Timber Press.
Yeah, well, we were absolutely blown away by Filbert's work, and honestly, some of the first books we saw, Bringing the Mediterranean into Your Garden, we just thought was one of the most beautiful books we'd ever seen in our life. And we kind of thought this publisher, this person gets it, and we think that we'd be a really good match.
Great. Well, I'm glad you made that match. And so I think perhaps over to you two guys to give us a presentation about the book, and then we've got some questions for you. I'm sure Kurt has got a thing or two to say because he usually does. He
Problematic.
gardens in a very harsh climate indeed, which I thought this book was probably pretty relevant. So over to you guys.
For everyone, my name is Kevin. This is my colleague, Michael. And Noel, thank you so much. It's an absolute honor to be on Garden Masterclass. And as he mentioned, Michael and I wrote a book called Shrub and Light, where we really extol the beauty of shrubland plant communities and explore some of the philosophies and strategies to better appreciate them, to understand their lessons, and to teach us how to partner with their creatures and create these dynamic and resilient gardens. This was our author photo for the book, and we really love being trapped in this little labyrinth, this little maze here. And so much of design and understanding and classification is about perception. And so we'd like to kick off tonight with a little bit of neuropsychology. Humans are pattern seekers. Our mammalian brains have something in it called the neocortex, which is the heaviest part of our entire brain by far. It's about 80% of the brain weight, and it's full of these neuron clusters that we call pattern recognizers. Once we figure out or are taught a pattern or a formula or rule, our brains look to apply it everywhere, taking the kind of random information of the world and projecting meaning out onto it. And in this way, we actually hallucinate our reality a little bit more than we receive it. And this makes pattern suggestion an incredibly powerful phenomenon. So we want to play this video clip from a televangelist show which aired during the Satanic Panic era of the 1980s.
To get critics even, or the skeptics, to show them what I'm going to do, I've actually taken the exact piece of tape that you just heard it off of, and I've reverse thread the machine, and I'm going to play that exact piece of tape backwards now. Okay, just to,
that you've not doctored
I have not doctored it in any way. All right, let's go ahead and start. Okay.
I heard something there.
All right, listen for I live with Satan. Exactly. You might want to turn it up just a little out here on the floor. I live with Satan. Listen again. Okay.
I live with
Somebody in
Satan.
the audience heard that. All right.
Now let's get that vote on videotape here. How many actually heard that? All right.
All right. Let's go on.
No, is that just, I don't know, ridiculous or miraculous? You hear the satanic message in pure gibberish once. It's kind of suggestive. The song in question is Stairway to Heaven by Led Zeppelin, a classic target of the Satanic Panic movement. And the technique that they're trying to expose is called backmasking, which has been deliberately done in many recordings, but not in this instance. Still, kind of this pattern, this phrase was suggested, and it was found on, the second time around. So this is kind of tricky. Our brain is a little tricky like this. Pattern recognition is a very powerful adaptation. It helps us to survive, to find food, to avoid danger, and it also informs most of our opinions, our preferences, and our prejudices, even about landscaping and the environment. While Stegner said we like what we know more often than we know what we like. We like what we've been exposed to, what we've been taught, and sometimes what we've been told to like. So a bit of disclosure, today we're going to try to upload the shrubland design code into your neocortex to kind of kickstart your shrubland pattern recognition systems and infect your minds a little bit like we feel ours have been. Michael and I both grew up in the deciduous forests of rural upstate New York, where these sort of dense woods are broken only by towns and farms. Our ecological, horticulture, and aesthetic training really started here amidst this lush sea of green. Our interest in shrublands really started when we moved west to Colorado. We both had the same amazed, visceral reaction to our new surroundings. We were shocked by the beauty and the starkness of our new environment. we were used to things like, woodlands and meadows, second or third growth forests, sometimes faux prairies and horticulturally designed areas, but these thickets of shimmering light drenched shrubs just really knocked us out. And our gateway shrubs were the ubiquitous workhorses of rapidbrush and sagebrush. They just have this frothing and eternal form full of primal earthly magic. And these are everywhere in the natural landscapes of Colorado. And they built in our brains the first rhythmic patterns of recognition, the first kind of structural framework to start understanding our new world. So our eyes were opened and we became really obsessed with the idea that shrublands were one of the last great untapped reservoirs of naturalistic design. And luckily, since we live in one of the world's shrubland epicenters, the North American shrub steppe, we had plenty of examples to back this theory up. Also, luckily, we get to travel a lot for our work, and we quickly saw that this beauty echoes far beyond the silver and brown that we were becoming used to. So with our new shrub goggles on, we saw the Devil's Club, Oplopanax hardis, and these brilliant fall colors carpeting the rain-drenched forest floors of the Pacific Northwest. We traveled to the rich heathland tapestries of temperate Europe, the pungent sclerophyllous Mediterranean scrub of the South African fynbos, and the acid-dipped, really spiny trip of the Patagonian montane scrub in South America. This Azarella spinosa is just so inviting and yet really kind of daunting at the same time. From afar, living vicariously through the travels and photos of others, we ogled the arid acacia woodlands of the Australian outback, the clematis and rhododendron wonderlands of Tibet, and the tropical thorn scrub of Mexico. We noticed their glossy leaves lighting up the understory of deciduous forests, and their bristling darkness being exposed by intense radiation and just persistent exposure. We met impossibly ancient shrubs as big and tortured as humans with dense necroarchitecture reminiscent of bones. We walked through shrubland communities more expansive than any of our cities or suburbs. And we examined the minuscule worlds of nanoscrub, these tight and self-contained, easy to walk right over communities, yet they kind of hold the very building blocks of the earth together. So we really saw that shrublands are everywhere, and they're complex and important ecosystems, both holding their own definite spaces and ambiguously weaving into others, and yet they often go unperceived. So we theorize that sometimes perhaps the shrub stands in the way of the greater scrub.
So this invisibility might be because shrublands and shrubs are understudied systems and creatures compared to their herbaceous and arboreal relatives. And really the categorization of growth forms into herbs, shrubs, and trees is a disturbingly ancient distinction going all the way back to Greek philosophers, and it's remained intact really largely since. Even though it's vague, the standard definitions of a shrub usually contain some consistent elements. A multi-stemmed wood-producing plant, usually smaller than a tree, but attempts to assign size or height ranges usually end up being futile. There's been a constant dispute about the basic definition of a shrub, but clearly we're kind of in agreement that it's something distinct, something intermediate. We tend to know them when we see them, in other words. But how far are we willing to push our definition of what a shrub could be? Are clonal trees that are connected by running underground root systems considered more shrub-like than tree-like? The status of the aspen tree is sacrosanct to some, but how does it really differ from a lot of prunus species, which are kind of at the edge of shrub and tree phenotypes? Under a heavy disturbance regime or stressful conditions, an aspen colony might never surpass shrub scale. And on the opposite end of the growth spectrum, on the right-hand side of the slide, Raulia, a map-forming, multi-stemmed woody perennial from the southern hemisphere. Is this any less of a shrub because its scale is so different than our traditional notions? An idea that we play with in the book is that shrubs are an intermediate growth form, something in between. They're an idea, both real and imposed by a priori human categories. And like so many organisms, they exist on a spectrum of thoughts and realities. And we kind of skirt the the demand to define them in the book, and because we really feel that it would be misrepresenting some of their truest qualities. In the book, we repurpose an idea from Timothy Morton's brilliant book called Dark Ecology. Morton says that so many ecological beings are, quote, excluded middles, and so much of ecological action is in the realm of not quite, slightly, gradations of yes. Shrubs live in this world of excluded middles, and they're slightly what they are, slightly what they're not. And in this space they occupy in the world, it's not really the space of the flora and plants that we walk over, and it's not the space of the plants that we walk under. It's the space of the flora we walk with. They're human-sized. Anthroflora is the term we use in the book. If forbs are fodder and trees are deities, then shrubs are equals, and this can be intimidating. But of course, as gardeners and ecologists and designers, we need to engage in some sort of classification to understand the dynamics of these plants and plant communities in the wild and in our cultivated spaces. Shrubs are living, they're evolved products of their environment, and their physical forms might be best understood through all of their varied survival adaptations. So shrubs often have multiple stems. This is an adaptation that allows them to spread out their biomass, kind of hedging their bets against damage, which trees usually put all the resources in one primary stem. When we standardize a shrub or prune it up, we're removing those stems and removing that evolved redundancy. Shrubs also have some of the deepest root systems of any plants on Earth, unlike herbaceous perennials and grasses, which only really draw from the top 12 inches of soil for moisture. Shrub root systems commonly draw anywhere from 18 inches to over 10 feet into the soil profile. This instills them with a greater drought tolerance than their herbaceous and graminoid relatives. So many shrubs run, they colonize open spaces, and by keeping these multiple growing points at ground level, shrubs have adapted to withstand environmental disturbances like fire or grazing. Shrublands like these are snapshots in time, like the one pictured here. In wetter climates, given enough sufficient years without disturbance, persistent woody bodies form at shrub and then maybe tree scale. But these landscapes are flexible, they're loaded with possibility, and they reject some of our more traditional notions about landscape maturity or successional climax. These are really all adaptations to extreme conditions, disturbance, or other environmental pressures. And shrublands are usually found in pretty extreme places. In our current era of global weirdness, climate change, extreme weather, shrubs are really doing just fine. Willows are advancing across the melting tundra, colonizing open permafrost. The forests of California and the western US burn, Yerba Santa and Ceanothus are filling in the voids. And as hurricanes erode the coastal dunes that no longer have their buffering estuaries, wax myrtle is putting down its roots. These shrublands are blueprints of the gardens of the future, and we feel that's not a small thing. And shrubs are also caretakers. Shrublands have some of the highest animal biodiversity outside of the tropics, and this is partially owing to the complex vegetative structures, that persistent woody material that allows them to harbor high numbers of plants and animals. These persistent branch forms slow the air in the boundary layer around them. They cast diffuse shadows and create microclimates of higher humidity and rich duff layers. When birds, mammals, and other organisms scurry, eat, and defecate in these spaces, they drop seeds and fertilizer at the base of the shrub, which now acts as a natural nursery. This nurse plant phenomenon, as it's called, was first observed in the relationship between desert shrubs, mesquite and creosote, and the saguaro cactus, an icon of the American West. It's since been identified in shrublands all over the world and has been shown that these facilitative effects, rather than competitive effects that we hear so often about, are really crucial for maintaining diverse ecosystems and maybe diverse gardens. So in productive times, the plants under the shrubs kind of flourish and spread out into the greater landscape, while in harsher times, the shrubs continue to kind of act as a refuge for the species, even as the greater plant community suffers.
So looking at shrubs through a cultural lens, they're not only keepers of their communities, but also kind of keepers of secrets and, darkness and light. And historically, they've been viewed as potentially kind of dangerous things. The word shrub finds its origins in the Proto-Indo-European word of skir or kur, meaning to cut. And skir was also used in the words scrape, scrap, shard, carnage, and carnal. If we look at the word shroud, it's an Old English word that, although from a different lineage, also has its origins in the words cut or shred. So different ideas with a real common thread there. And the questions are, what does a shrub shroud? Is it something carnage or is it something carnal, something destructive or creative? And shrubs are weird, just like us, they take up space, they take up our space. They can be gangly and awkward, cute or monstrous. They really do a good job at inhabiting the uncanny valley, and where the more that they look like us, the stranger that they make us feel. And this idea is taken head on in a work of art that we think is very relevant by the artists Sean Boyle and Stephen Booth. This is called The Bit. And in it, they present this anthropomorphic, dreamlike figure with a fantastical, possibly threatening presence and pose. And in a statement for the piece, they said, "We want to play with an object to create an uncanny sense of life, one that might teeter back and forth between recognizable and unrecognizable in the same glance." And we tend to deny or erase this property or presence of shrubs through pruning, shearing, and taming them into these more cartoony, more farmed, kind of easier forms, which has led to the detested American green meatball, or the I think international foundation planting, forcing them to become these strange, isolated, commoditized things. These are essentially zoo creatures. When we leave shrubs wild, it forces us to face them, which can also help us accept them and recognize that they are living creatures with their own intentions and secrets, not just our architectural or horticultural fodder. So it's really time to bring them home and to put them in the context of the shrubland. So shrublands are often perceived as challenging, tangled, illegible, sinister, chaotic spaces. They're described as wastelands of hidden rooms and impenetrable walls, concealers of predator and prey. The slide that's on the screen right now is a representation of a rhododendron thicket, which was actually called a rhododendron hell by the early American colonists. The scrub is also seen as agriculturally unproductive ground, right? Full of trash plants, too woody to graze, too thick and thorny to navigate. The classic agricultural view has always been to burn it or chain it, but just change it, right? And this dialogue, these cliches might be one of the biggest reasons that we've never really embraced shrublands in our design landscapes. And these prejudices also really distract from the deep ecological connections, the stunning beauty, and the enduring productivity spaces. On the other hand, we've had a far easier time accepting and adapting things like these grasslands or forests or savanna ecosystems into our gardens, because they're mostly reminders of abundance. They conjure images of fire-regimented hunting grounds and shaded grazing grounds, agricultural and pastoral scenes that really promise harvest, security, and comfort. They're spaces that tend to exalt human control, landscapes that are really intoxicants of ease and relaxation. Whereas shrublands put us maybe a little bit more on edge. They possibly belong to that pre-agrologistic era of hunting and gathering. And if we view them through that lens, they can also be places of abundance. With that presence of animals and easy to reach stems here, they're kind of providers of forage and food and fuel. And something like this, a well-browsed or shaped natural shrubland, may indicate grazing and nearby animals to hunt. In the new brilliant book, Hedgelands by Christopher Hart, he explores the mostly discarded practice of creating these living mixed species woody hedges throughout the UK, extolling their wide-ranging virtues from habitat creation to crop production, and really argues that we need to make space for and learn to live again among these sort of complicated biotic structures. He also points out something really interesting, which is that these hedges are only replacements, stand-ins, kind of analogs for the vast thorn scrub that covered almost all of the UK and Europe since the beginning of the Holocene, which was around 12,000 years ago. And that only really changed because of human activities and the decline of megafauna. So that thorn scrub might not really cover Europe anymore, but in many places the land is still covered in these shrublands. And in our quest to start seeing shrublands and their applications in our landscape more comprehensively, we really found it useful to consider two major categories, the model shrubland and the alternative shrubland. A model shrubland is a classic stable shrubland biome that exists where environmental conditions place plants under almost constant considerable stress, and landscape succession happens very slowly, if ever. For example, the extreme pH ranges of heathland, the aridity of deserts, or the constant shaping wind of coastlines are all hosts of very stable, long-lived shrublands. And these shrublands are also very extensive. They cover huge swaths of continents, and they run for thousands of miles along coastlines. The other category, alternative shrublands, exist in more limited spaces, liminal conditions, or shorter timescales, and they're often nestled into or they play at the edges of other dominant plant communities. These shrublands often depend on disturbance events like fire, flooding, or grazing to create extreme or abnormal conditions that interrupt a stable state. The idea of alternative shrublands also embraces plant forms and morphologies that act like shrubs and form extensive communities, like Michael talked about earlier, but might not often be such. So let's go exploring and do a little bit of a thought experiment together. So Noel, suppose you drop some acid, or maybe you jumped in a sensory deprivation tank, or meditated really hard, or even just droned around on Google Earth for a while, which in its own form is a type of meditation, and you decide to have a really nerdy out-of-body experience and remote view the shrublands of the world, and you just happen to turn up in the US. This is a journey you might go on. So coming from the east, the first thing you might encounter is the tortured tuckamore and the vibrant heathlands of the windy and salt-battered New England coastal scrub. This is full of rhododendrons and blueberries. Flying west, deeper into the forest, you'd move into these edgeland habitats of overgrown woodlands and abandoned agricultural fields, encountering unequaled wildlife refuge in just great thickets of things like elderberry, roses, meadowsweet, viburnum, and dogwood. Going even deeper, you'd find these breaks in the forest that reveal inland barrens, these geologic oddities of sand and stone deposits hosting masses of dwarf oaks, sweet ferns, huckleberries, and sassafras, all dependent on periodic fire to hold back the encroaching conifers. This is one of those semi-stable alternative shrubland areas. Drifting down the mid-Atlantic and southern coastal dunes, you'd find places where fine sands are held together by the deep roots of things like beach plums, groundsel trees, wax myrtle, and sea grapes, making the first and the last stand against the battering waves here. And then following the dune line inland, you'd find the Pocosin, the humid, tangled shrub swamps, and lose your mind even further in the explosion of inkberry, swamp titi, sweet pepperbush, and sourwood, shown here adorning their sort of autumn explosion of colors.
Traveling up through Appalachia, we encounter the mountain summit balds, full of rhododendrons and mountain laurel, high bush blueberry, and bush honeysuckle. And out onto the plains, the Great Plains of North America into the Midwest, woven throughout the memories of old tall grass prairie and mixed grass prairie, are thickets of wild plums, New Jersey tea, prairie crab apples, prairie willow, sumac, and lead plant.
We hope that you are enjoying this recording from Garden Masterclass's Thursday Garden Chat program. We started doing this in April 2020 during the first COVID lockdown, when we did it 5 days a week for 2 months, which was a wonderful experience. Since then, we've carried on doing it just for one session a week. We have always done this as a public service. We initially started it as a morale booster for the garden and landscape industry during a very difficult time, and we've so loved doing it that we've carried on doing this. But our presenters give their time for free. We give our time for free. We do incur costs, administrative, technical, and sometimes for support staff, and we would very much appreciate the odd donation to help us keep going and help keep this a free service, which we'd very much like to do. So please go to our homepage, and down at the bottom there's a donate button, and we'll be very grateful. Thank you.
And further to the north, in the cold steppes of the Dakotas, there's rich pockets of silver buffalo berry, fire cherry, hazelnut, and American plum. Right up to the edge of the Great American Steppe and at the base of the Rocky Mountains, skirted by the silvery gleam of sagebrush. And then sort of in the exaggerated, nuanced geologies of the American West, where life zones change very quickly and dramatically, offering a new shrubland community with every change in elevation or aspect. Rabbitbrush, sand sage, sand cherry, skunkbush, sumac, and winter fat all find their home here and are scattered throughout the shortgrass steppe. And as the plains rise up into the mountains, big sagebrush mixes in with things like gamble oak, serviceberry, mountain mahogany, mountain spray, and maple, skirting the sides of mountains. And then in the wet montane shrublands, dozens of species of willows weave throughout the precious river water that comes down from snowmelt and trace their lines through every life zone in the American West. All the way up to the subalpine zone in the mountains, Krumholtz junipers blow across the landscape, dwarfed by the environment, accumulating deadwood on the windward side and growing fresh biomass in their own leeward shelter. And then all the way to the alpine, where tight cushions and these mycelia-like expanses of subshrubs like currant, kinnikinnick, willow, bilberry, and mountain dryad mix with tight hummocks of cushion plants.
Then once you get beyond the Rockies in the Great Basin or the Great Sagebrush Sea, this is a 500,000 square mile expanse of Artemisia. You'll find yourself really engulfed in this raging torrent of fragrance and plains and canyons, all coated with things like blackbrush and greasewood, ephedra and fernbush. And then flowing down these escarpments further into the southwest, you dive into the hot and dry world here, where the Trans-Pecos and the Chihuahuan desert scrub mix with really bold and defensive forms of classic succulents like yucca, agave, and prickly pear, and this melee of things like creosote bush, mesquite, osatillo, and four-winged saltbush, or one of our species of Atriplex. Then you can California dream yourself towards the Cascades and climb into the oak woodlands as they spill into the chaparral here of chamise, manzanita, black sage, the super important poison oak, and of course, California lilac. Then for hundreds of miles across the Pacific coast, there's this knotted tapestry of soft sage scrub, which just kind of washes over you. That's full of buckwheat, coastal sagewort, coyote brush, kind of dwarfed or diminutive forms of things that you'd see larger further up in the mountains because of that constant effect of the ocean. And then finally landing back in the cooler, kind of wetter world of the Pacific Northwest, you feast on the bounty of snowberry, brambles, hazelnuts, and grape hollies, which are all populating the dense understory here. And really, this is our way to try and show the realization that this adventure could be repeated with different shrub communities across almost every continent on Earth. So how do we start making sense of these places for our home landscapes? How do we turn the shrubland into the shrubscape, right? One of the first approaches that we might take is expanding our artistic and aesthetic touch points to help us interpret the shapes and masses and strange actions that we tend to find in shrublands by shrubs and other plants. But artistically, shrublands have had kind of a small PR problem. Monet, whose impressionistic works are referenced so often in our sort of modern perceptions and appreciations and guidance in naturalistic gardens, he really had some issues with shrublands. Of the Mediterranean maquis, which is the quote on the screen, Monet said it's too thick and there's always parts with lots of details, a jumble terrible to render. And of course, a man of isolated trees and vast spaces, right? Isolated trees and vast spaces, those are right farms, maybe for lucky, meadows, cliffs, maybe savannas, but these dense shrublands were a challenge to Monet. And in painting them, he was kind of forced to create a thicker, wilder impressionism, something that kind of in detail verges on deep abstraction. So instead, let's turn to abstraction, and in this case, abstract expressionism, which really opens up new ways to view the world and new ways to react to the world, all in a non-representational framework. So these are contemplative and meditative compositions. They have impact just by their spatial magic. So similarly, without even knowing the plant species in the right-hand picture, just by viewing it, you kind of know how exciting and influential the spatial patterning can be in it. Abstract expressionism also has kind of an interesting part to it, which is that it doesn't necessarily discount or seek to control the actions or the intentions of the materials that are used to create these artworks. And this is still such a foreign idea in alive garden design, right? Not controlling the materials that we work with, i.e. just allowing the plants to express themselves fully and live. Post-vandalism and graffiti are also great models for gardens. These guttural sort of elemental acts of collage and decay are living collaborative systems. Paintings are enshrined. The Monet piece that we saw before will probably never change if the conservators have anything to do with it, but these representations are active and dangerous. They're constantly in the process of blooming new populations on this space, and we'll probably never be able to find these moments again in either of the pictures, and this to us is a garden. We can also use pop and graphic art and even to help us move the conversation of naturalist design forward and help us kind of penetrate the idea of shrubs and shrublands by playing off the origin, the iconism, and the celebrity of these plants. So, this piece kind of asks the question, how do classic garden shrubs like lilac and smokebush fit into the urban aesthetic of modern Romania, and how come this with their wild shrubland occurrences could possibly create a new style of planting in Eastern Europe?
So we also use abstraction throughout the book to highlight the spatial patterning that makes each of the landscapes that we profile interesting. We call them the extracts, and here we touch on the neo-expressionist movement to create these little kind of Keith Haring-esque shrublands. These are geometric simplifications, and they can be used to kind of transpose layouts and the effects of these landscapes elsewhere, kind of like onto the rectangular lawns or gardening plots of most of suburbia. So for example, this is a heathland in the Saco Preserve in southern Maine. It formed over thousands of years as decaying organic material filled a series of ponds, eventually merging them together. Hundreds of species interweave here, holding down about 20 feet of peat substrate. And untangling this into a legible design could feel really daunting. Or it could be maybe pretty simple. So Chamaedaphne caliculata, leatherleaf, separates the other shrubby masses here. It creates these kind of islands of accumulation and contrast. A few well-placed larger shrubs, perennials, or trees with upright habits help break this up and add dimension to the maelstrom. In a home landscape, maybe this translates really well to a more controlling gardener who wants a wild aesthetic because it provides distinct spaces for, because this technique provides kind of distinct spaces for the main species, but still allowing for like interaction and evolution. But control is tricky, and the key will not be to control this design here, this abstraction as a final outcome, but let the plant's natural interactions play out. And really, that's how we think that you recreate the spirit and energy of a place, even if it's not exactly in plant placement. So it's sort of the opposite end of the moisture spectrum and the opposite end of the continent. In the California chaparral, chamise, or Adenostema fasciculatum, is the dominant player here. It's has delicate white flowers and foliage that's really reminiscent of rosemary. And it's this uncomplicated hook that cuts through the heavy rifts of Eriogonum, California buckwheat, and black sage that are so common in the chaparral. In the heavy western light and kind of deep shadows that form as a result, it might obscure some of the patterning. But once you kind of tease it out, something that looks maybe like camouflage or animal skin emerges. And really, these are just jumping off points and places to begin thinking about shrubland composition through this kind of neo-expressionist abstract lens before diving deeper into your own methods for sowing intricacy, diversity, and chaos into your own gardens. So shrublands are sometimes weird places, and sometimes you have to do weird things to try to understand how to design with them. This is a process that we call attunement in the book, where you adapt fully to the reality of other beings by incorporating kind of reflecting aspects of that being through ourselves in our work or our processes. This picture was deemed a little too disturbing to be included in our book, but here, dressing in camouflage and garbage, walking among an Anthropocene shrubscape is really a type of attunement, a way to get in, understand the other living worlds around us.
And making and stewarding gardens is another type of attunement. In the introduction to the book, The American Meadow Garden, still one of the premier books on grassland-inspired naturalistic design, John Greenlee says that he had to plant his grassland before he wrote about it. And so in the years leading up to and including the writing of Shrouded in Light, we did much the same. The first shrubland-inspired garden that we planted was called the LA Wave. It's a privately owned urban shrubscape that reimagines the intersections of Southern Californian coastal sage scrub with mixed chaparral. This garden was established with modified Hitchmauian methods. So we planted dozens of shrubs and sowed a full seed mix of annuals, perennials, and grasses in a deep layer of sand here. And this was a pretty radical departure from a lot of the post-war rose landscapes of classic Los Angeles, and even a departure from the xeriscaped kind of succulent mess of more modern times. And part of its uniqueness was the celebration of seasonality in a land known for kind of endless summer, really two major seasons. After this exuberant kind of spring flowering from all the interstitial species, the heavy masses of shrubs faded to hues of olive and gold in the heat and the drought of summer. And the dormant grasses then kind of acted as this low light for the shifting shades of the shrubby canopy above it. Technique and impulse and nonconformity were really the driving elements of the LA Wave. We shoveled 4 tons of sand while blasting Bad Religion off the porch and planted while listening to Ceremony on repeat. This is a hardcore punk shrubscape at its heart. Another shrubscape we made is called Summer Home Garden, which is a public pocket park in Denver, Colorado, with a plant palette that's really based on the shrublands of Southern Colorado and the desert Southwest. It was established on principles of education, water conservation, and accessibility. Its mission is really to inspire the greater community to xeriscape fearlessly and comprehensively using common commercially available plants. And in the semi-arid environment that we live in, you really do have to be fearless to xeriscape this hard. The garden layout was inspired by a graffitied utility box using a technique that we call wild systems emulation that seeks surprising actions to be the starting point or jumping off point for a design. This in itself is a radical object that's been spray painted, stickered, wheat pasted, sat upon, and just battered by the elements for years. And the result was this urban collage that no singular kind of being or person or force could have really planned or intuited. So we took the plant groupings that were determined to be the distinct communities for each space, and then randomly laid them out within the spatial suggestions of this. And I'm going just by these markings. And the result was a very active, bright, and immersive space, just kind of full of its own agency. A really surprising garden with constantly changing colors, forms, and textures, with the shrubby layers sort of rising and falling throughout the season. It has a true wildness, but maybe a false wilderness about it.
We also wanted to do something a little different. So we made digital cyber shrubscapes using artificial intelligence to show us shrubland-inspired gardens. And the programs really came up with some really incredible visions. So these digital shrubscapes are created by deep learning, text-to-image modeling software, and they give us an evocative glimpse into our own collective understandings of shrublands and gardens. And by asking AI to create these shrubland-based gardens for us, we're asking the program to learn, what do we collectively consider a shrubscape based on our own species work in the physical realm? These shrubscapes have been willed into existence by us, and now they exist out there as further interpretations of these communities on our shared learning spaces.
So really, we've we've barely scratched the surface of what's possible when sort of implementing, emulating, and taking inspiration from shrubby landscapes. And we really hope that this book helps to bring other, shrub freaks and practitioners into the like, other shrublanders. We really believe in inspiration over instruction, and our goal with all this is really just to share the insights evoked by some of our favorite plant communities, or maybe the favorite ones we've encountered so far, and the wild places that we've seen, in hopes that you might also be captivated and motivated and emotionally provoked. So this is your formal or informal invitation to collaborate with these creatures, if you don't do it already, to set something in motion, start somewhere and end up somewhere else. And really, above all, do what you want. Embrace the idea of no control. Embrace your role as an imperfect human messing around on this earth, creating beautiful and ugly things, creating for yourself and creating for others. And as you design, build, destroy, and impose the kind of future natures or nature cultures of the world into existence, just consider the awesome partner that you have in the beauty and the complexity and the perseverance of shrublands. So thank you all.
Well, thank you. That was fantastic summary of a really amazing book. And I must say, I loved, and I think some of our viewers have loved the use of art, both figurative and abstract, in explaining the concept. I mean, it's very unusual to have a garden book that relates, I think, so much to the rest of the cultural and artistic world. And there were several. The book also needs a soundtrack, and if it did have a soundtrack, it might be a little bit like this. Okay, that was Fuck the Universe from Craft. And I've got a couple of other black metal suggestions, which I might refrain from playing, or I might play. So tell us a bit about that connection between black metal and shrubscapes.
Sure, yeah. I think one of the first connections that we really saw were the inner forms of shrubs, and especially the way that shrubs could harbor both dead and living tissue at the same time. And we came to call that necroarchitecture. And in some of the explorations, especially of like fully burned out shrubs, we could see that entire sort of inner ligneous build out. It really reminded us of the symbols used for, or used by, a lot of metal bands, whether it be black metal or death metal, or just these kind of extreme music bands. And so a real connection there. The symbols that are used by these bands are often referred to as sigils, which is sort of a magical term, meaning that this symbol is imbued with the intentions of the creator to sort of achieve some sort of end. And usually in the case of these musicians, they just kind of hide the band name in them, which is almost like you're taking a visual impression of this object and somehow subliminally accepting the band name. And we really thought with shrubs, you're doing much the same. As you take your sort of visual impression of this shape of the shrub, you're absorbing so much of its life, of its time, of the things that lived in it, lived with it, and ultimately where it might kind of end up in the future. We also really, I mean, our connections or cultural entrance points into the world, we found were maybe much different than the ones being represented in some of the traditional horticultural volumes that are being published. And knowing that we are nothing but standard gardeners at our heart, and knowing how intelligent and complex a lot of our coworkers and colleagues around the world are, we knew that there was definitely a need to expand and open up some of these cultural references or touch points. And going through hardcore and metal music and punk music seemed like a really natural kind of venue and entrance for these places that might also be considered a little bit bristly or outside of like the pop culture world.
Yeah, great. Good on you for bringing all that in. Now, Kurt, you work in some pretty extreme climates with a wide range of plants. I was just wondering how the book spoke to you in South Australia.
Well, it speaks to me nicely. I mean, I really enjoy it, and I love the landscapes and everything. It's just how do you get that across to the common public, the common gardener? I think it's quite the challenge. It's a step too far in a way. Everyone is so conservative, and so it's quite the challenge. I mean, people have to push to that the very extremes, and so that's why it's so good to see. It's but it's just that challenge of actually getting the masses on board. They like to stick to what they know. I saw a discussion on Instagram with Nigel Dunnett, and someone he mentioned the book, and someone had mentioned with the greatest of respect. It was a very polite argument that they were having. It kept on saying, with the greatest of respect, I just don't think shrubs are the way to go. And Nigel goes, well, with the greatest of respect, I think you're wrong. And because we've just seen, as we've seen with every type of plant usage, plant design, it gets abused and it gets done very, very badly because you still need a degree of skill. So I'm just sort of wondering, with the authors, like I suppose how they see it being brought into more of the common space, I suppose.
Yeah. Certainly the book is not a pragmatic one, and we make that admission a few times throughout. And I think most of our goal was to really convey, hopefully through the use of photography, the innate beauty of these systems, both for garden use, but also just how widespread they are on the surface of the earth. And I do think, just like metal music or any other sort of extreme genre, it's an invitation for others to like partner in and like understand that that's an acceptable way to garden too. It's anything that exists on a margin may never be mainstream, and we're maybe accepting or like cognizant of that. But we also want to like stress that these challenges have been met before by other systems. So like I think, you know, bringing a wild Lesotho meadowland into cultivation required a lot of like modification and changes and stylizing to make it horticulturally suitable and palatable, as you guys are kind of suggesting, by the broader public. So I do think like this is always an iterative process, and like bringing shrublands into that and having more folks experiment with it can only kind of like own that for various climates around the world.
Yeah. And we do like to get into the prickly bits, and I know we use the word chaos and extreme a lot in that, but I think first and foremost, we really try to stun the reader with the beauty of these places, and in them really find a deeper connection to a lot of the landscapes that are presented through the new perennial movement and have sort of captured, you know, the public's eye, especially in a lot of public spaces or public works. And yeah, I think that's, at least from my perspective, that's an undeniable part of the book, is just the extreme beauty of it. And I think that's really, you know, even if it's a shallow way, aesthetically winning the public over is, you know, the first way to go. And I think that that's even been proven through Sheffield University's work, right? So that's definitely how I'd approach it first, especially with clients, is not going to the extreme bits. Maybe it seems like they want their minds or eyes opened a little bit, like delving further into what the acceptance of shrublands or shrubland community can offer, the danger, the mystery, the intrigue, but really start with the beauty. And then as I think Claire Takesh wrote in the intro to Visionary, her new book, you know, we are quickly recognizing that beauty is not enough anymore, right? Beauty is not enough in these gardens. And the fact that these shrubland-based gardens or shrub community-based gardens really offer so much more complexity, habitat diversity, real deep and complex layering, is a huge selling point.
I think it has to be beauty. I think it has to be. I think it has to be the extreme, and it has to be the beauty. I would disagree with her comment, and because obviously beauty is a consideration. You know, everyone is very subjective as to what is beautiful. I think it's precisely, it has to be beautiful, and it has to be read. It has to be so beautiful that just the common public can actually, even though they don't understand it, they just see it as far as color, form, whatever. It just has to be at such a high standard. So I think what you're saying exactly, you have to go to the extreme, and then you drag a percentage of the population towards you. Not all the way; they'll never get there. But you do your own thing. You make it as beautiful as you can. You push as hard as you can. I have this theory regarding like pop music. Pop music is garbage. Who would want that? And it's the same thing, like maybe not so much pop art. If you go into Andy Warhol, I always talk about the pop garden. I don't actually want a pop garden. I use this idea as far as who would want a pop garden. It's a popular garden. We want the anti-pop garden. Personally, for me personally, and that's what you're talking about. You want the extreme. And we get into music. The kind of music we like is layered. It builds. It's got all these elements to it. But with pop music, it's a song. You hear it the first time, it's got a loop that catches you. But the 10th time you hear it in the supermarket, you just hate it. You just think it's just the most ghastly trash. But a song that you don't like straight away, it builds on you, and you start listening to it, and you hear all these other little elements. And I think that is the thing. It's the anti-pop.
Yeah, I'm not sure we particularly disagree with that. I think we like urge folks just at the beginning of this presentation to be cognizant of like, again, how much of the world is hallucinated or projected, and how much that has to do with like cultural, like constantly changing cultural currents and evolution that is part of that. So I think we're saying the same thing, where it's like,
I think we
by
are too,
practicing
really.
by practicing at the sort of extreme end of this, it like feeds back into the greater cultural kind of elements and can hopefully move that forward.
I mean, the landscapes are fantastic. I mean, it's just like yes, yes, yes. Just the normies. You know, it's a whole. You forget, because I'm not sure about you, but you exist within these spaces, and everyone's just feeding off each other, and you're just looking at stuff, and you're just pushing hard, and then there's a whole different world that we just forget about, which is good in a way. I don't really want to know about that world, to tell you the truth. I want to just play in pretend land. It's much more fun.
And we've had
sorry, I digress.
The question that kind of bears on this question of public acceptance. Do you find clients want quicker results than some shrubs can take? Are there a few go-tos that you use for quick results to please them? I mean, the whole success of the perennial movement over the last 20 years has made people think that, we can have an instant garden within 2 years. And indeed, large-scale perennial planting has been compared unfavorably to Victorian bedding for this very reason. And that the previous generation's reliance on woody plants was involved a much greater exercise in patience. I mean, are there any particular shrubs that you would use perhaps to sort of keep people's interest going, in a sense of what they're going to get while the rest of the stuff develops, almost perhaps kind of like nurse shrubs for the impatient client's soul?
I think that at least our strategy up to this point has been installing shrubs into a system with multiple plant forms, morphologies, and growth rates and times, right? So promising instant results is only, I think, possible if your client has a ton of money that they want to drop on like ball and burlap or like huge 10 or 20 gallon shrubs at a time, in which case it would definitely give you that instant result. But if you are moving slower, more economically, we really kind of sell that idea of doing that dense combination of planting and seeding and really taking advantage of all that incredible sowing beauty work that's already been done, and a lot of the incredible perennial movement work that's been done. Installing these spaces that after a season or two will have one certain effect, and then after seasons 3 to 5 will feel much different, all really depending on how you cultivate or control or allow that space to run and change. And I think that's part of selling it, is not ever promising something instant and just be like, no, this is going to be a process. If you want this garden, you're going to have to move through it with the space.
Yeah, I mean, I certainly found it.
Do you want me to do it? But
yeah,
again, I love rabbit brush
experience
for our region. Very specific. If you want a specific shrub, Ericameria nauseosa, at least in our region, which I know won't be applicable to many other people.
Sorry, what was that again?
There's a shrub out in the Western US called rubber rabbit brush, or Ericameria nauseosa, which has a pretty fantastically fast growth form. and something that we absolutely love to install in gardens here for pretty much first season effects of it growing a few feet and even flowering from a very small
Yes.
seedling.
Yeah.
And it's something that seeds so heavily too, you can rogue it out pretty quickly, or keep it in scale.
That's useful. That's useful to be able to do that. Yeah, in my experience, 4 years in a Portuguese garden, things develop at very different paces, and you can have things that give you an effect pretty quickly, but then they tend to need controlling to allow slower growing stuff to develop. Tracy wants to know if you've been to Scotland and what do you think of Scottish shrubscapes and have you been to Scotland?
I've been to Scotland.
I've not been to Scotland.
I went to Scotland last year, and I went in. It was late May, early June, so I didn't see the heathlands in flower, but we saw incredible sort of cotton grass growing above those heaths, which were just absolutely magical, and saw the gorse in full bloom, which took my breath away, and I still think about it all the time. So yeah, I think Scotland was incredible, and I think the shrubland. The emulation potential of the Scottish shrublands are really just endless.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, that seems to be most developed, I think, in the Netherlands, where you've got a lot of very acidic peatlands, and actually quite a long tradition of managing a semi-natural vegetation in places like the parks in Amstelveen around Amsterdam, where they are using the natural succession processes very, very creatively and constructively. And my main comment really is that I think we need very much a typology of shrubs that, okay, the results may look kind of chaotic, but every plant species actually has got a set of genetically imposed rules which it is following, and the outcomes are what may be chaotic, but the plant itself has an agenda which is actually predictable. And I mean, because I live in Portugal, we're on these very granite uplands with actually a very degraded scrub flora. But if you get onto the limestone, you have these incredibly dense habitats, what the French would call maquis, matoche here, where you have much more diversity of species. And I very much feel that there's a whole range of different competitive strategies that enable a very wide range of plants to occupy the same space, but through really forming hummocks, others are sort of penetrating those hummocks, others are creeping out from under below. There's a whole range of physical spatial relations going on, which kind of I feel we need to unpack and understand to move the whole field forward. So it's past now 7 o'clock, and it's well past Kurt's bedtime. So I think perhaps we should wrap up there. And I very much look forward to commissioning you guys for some sort of webinar event with us sometime from the autumn onwards. I think we've got a huge amount, designers got a huge amount to learn from you. We look forward to talking about that with you. Thank you everybody for coming. And next week, we're staying in North America. We're going to Texas. Second time we're going to Texas in a month, I think. So hopefully see you all then. And thanks for joining us. And thank you very much, Michael and Kevin and Kurt, for joining us this evening.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
See ya.
We hope that you are enjoying this recording from Garden Masterclass's Thursday Garden Chat programme. We started doing this in April 2020 during the first COVID lockdown, when we did it 5 days a week for 2 months, which was a wonderful experience. Since then, we've carried on doing it just for one session a week. We have always done this as a public service. We initially started it as a morale booster for the garden and landscape industry during a very difficult time. And we've so loved doing it that we've carried on doing this. But our presenters give their time for free. We give our time for free. We do incur costs, administrative, technical, and sometimes for support staff. And we would very much appreciate the odd donation to help us keep going and help keep this a free service, which we'd very much like to do. So please go to our homepage, and down at the bottom there's a donate button, and we'll be very grateful. Thank you.